Team Fortress 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. It might as well be my number one, honestly. Having played for 7 years now and having a couple thousand hours invested, I've experienced the wackiness that is TF2 more than a few times.
Do you think I should actually play seriously for once?
Maybe.
Thank you!
Intelligence. We have.
Today though, I'm not here to talk about my appreciation for this game. Instead, I'm here to talk about something you might have not thought about too much. Trains. Yes, being an avid rail fan, I've definitely noticed the abundance of trains in TF2. So today, I'm going to be comparing the in-game train models to their real-life counterparts, and give some info on their origins and history. This is a bit of a spiritual sequel to my Trains of Half-Life video, so feel free to check that one out after this video. Anyway, like the Half-Life video, I'll be covering locomotives first, and then railroad infrastructure second, which is a new segment for this video, and rolling stock or freight cars third and last. As Team Fortress 2 transitioned from a realistic military shooter to the industrial mid-20th century art style we all know and love, several pieces of concept art, unused ideas, and conceptual ideas for maps and the classes were created. On that note, trains and railroads made a handful of appearances in conceptual map art and early map designs. We'll start with the ever-so-famous 2-Fort. In this pre-2006 trailer version of the map, there's two small untextured locomotives. In a textured release, the locomotive appears brown and the second engine has been replaced with two freight cars. The engine also seems to appear in this piece of artwork as well. From these screenshots, the locomotive seems to be based on a General Electric 44-tonner or 80-tonner diesel locomotive. The 44-tonner was built from 1940 to 1956, while the 80-tonner was built from 1940 and into the 50s. Rebuilds, however, occurred as late as the 1990s. Both were used in American rail yards performing switching duties along with busy freight work on industrial railroads and in factories and mills. In TF2's case, they would fit and work well serving the grain elevator. Several of these wartime engines remain in revenue freight switching and industrial service. They can also be seen on tourist railroads pulling passengers on scenic lines. Moving on to some concept freight cars, we can see that covered grain hopper cars were originally planned to show up on 2-Fort. This particular piece reveals the cars were modeled after 3-bay covered hopper cars built by the American Car and Foundry Company, better known as ACF. These cars were built between 1967 and 1972 to haul dry bulk commodities like salt, fertilizer, dry chemicals, bauxite, bulk agricultural product, and in this case, grain. Returning to the screenshot mentioned earlier, there's two hoppers behind the switching engine, a red and orange hopper with a dark gray one behind it. The red and orange one seems to be a Pullman standard-built hopper car design from the late 1960s. The hopper behind it appears to be a 3-bay hopper as previously mentioned as well. Moving on from 2-Fort to Well is this art piece. Up front we have an orange boxcar that says B&O on the side. B&O stands for the famous Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. This is one of the few, if only, direct railroad references in any TF2 media. The boxcar seems to be based on typical 1940s 40-foot boxcar designs, although a bit freelance with a significantly pitched roof. The gray boxcar coupled behind it appears to just be a generic 40-foot boxcar.
After 9 years in development,
Team Fortress 2 was released to the public on October 10th, 2007. On that note, we'll move on to the retail release of TF2 and its trains. We're gonna start out on Well, the first map to feature the infamous train. It's also Gabe Newell's favorite map.
my favorite maps are well, basically, because I keep getting run over by the train. I've been killed by that train, by the trains, more than any other opponent in that game. You'd think I would have learned by now.
Introduced in the January 25th, 2008 patch, the locomotive can be found idling on both blue and red sides of the rail yard. Its road number reads 7331, a reversed version of 1337 or LEET. The locomotive is based on a Southern Pacific Railroad or SP EMD GP35 or GP38-2. The GP35 was introduced in 1963 with the GP38-2 being introduced in 1972. Both of these engines seem to fit within TF2's time frame of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Comparing the in-game model, the paint scheme and design is just about identical to the SP's bloody nose scheme introduced in 1958. It uses the flanged wings design on the nose, and the engine's color is predominantly gray, albeit a little bit of a brown hue. Horn, headlight, and beacon placements are also pretty consistent with the real thing. The only real differences are the proportions being a bit shorter and taller, use of an orange color and additional paint line along the side, missing numbers below the cab windows, and use of freight car trucks instead of locomotive ones. Obviously, as well, the Southern Pacific name is replaced with Northern Express, Northern being the polar opposite of Southern. Going back to the orange paint, it's not entirely fictional, as inspiration might have been taken from the experimental orange and black Halloween scheme used on the SP in mid-1958. The horn seems to resemble the sound of a Nathan P3, a horn commonly used on the Southern Pacific Railroad. A few examples of the SPGP-38-2 remain in service on the Union Pacific Railroad, while most, if not all, SPGP-35 examples have been sold or scrapped. The next locomotive seen in-game is this small gas-powered switcher. Look familiar? Well, that's because it's the same blue locomotive from the 2006 reveal trailer. It seems to be based on this 30-ton engine built by the Davenport Locomotive Works. In this case, it's the Durango and Rio Grande Western Railroad, or DRGW, engine number 50. It was built in 1937 for switching duties on the Sumter Valley Railroad in Oregon, USA, until it was sold to the DRGW in 1963. There it performed similar duties until 1970, when it was sold to Roaring Camp and Big Trees Railroad, and later the Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad. It stayed inoperable at the DNS only a couple of years until being sold to the Colorado Railroad Museum in 1984. There it was restored to operational condition, and it currently remains there on display in Golden, Colorado. Interestingly enough, the real-life counterpart is a narrow gauge 3-foot locomotive, unlike the rest of TF2's rail infrastructure, which is the standard 4 feet 8.5 inch gauge. On the map Banana Bay, the engine makes a lethal but interactive appearance like the Northern Express engine, and has a distant horn sound that plays before it approaches. The horn sounds like that of a Nathan K5LA. However, the biggest issues with the locomotive in-game are it's given a steam locomotive chuffing, whistle, and bell sound when up close, plus steam out of the exhaust stack. This is completely inaccurate for a gas-powered locomotive, and it kind of annoys me. Our next subject is from the End of the Line update implemented in December of 2014. The engine seen in the SFM and in-game on the map Snowplow resembles that of an EMD GP60M. I previously discussed the GP60 in the Trains of Half-Life video, but the GP60M does have its unique differences compared to the one aforementioned. The GP60M was built exclusively for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, or ATSF, better known as the Santa Fe Railway. It was built from May to September in 1990 and notably featured the wider North American safety cab. It also had 2 teardrop-shaped windows compared to the standard GP60, which had a standard EMD cab and 4 windows. It was used for general and fast freight service on the Santa Fe system. When the Burlington Northern Railroad and Santa Fe Railway merged in 1995 to create Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway, or BNSF, they took control of both railroads' equipment. This included the GP60M, and examples were rebuilt beginning in 2014 and remain in service as of 2020. In TF2, the model has been greatly downsized to fit the narrow track gauge of payload maps. Its headlight is also a bit higher on the nose compared to the real-life locomotive. This next train might be a bit more obscure and unnoticed, but on the Man vs. Machine map, Manhattan, a subway train is seen to the left just outside of Resupply. It also appears on District with a slightly different color scheme and number. It bears resemblance to the New York City Metro Transit Authority, or NYC MTA, R32. These were built from 1964 to 1965, and a few can still be seen running above and below the streets of New York. The next and final locomotive of Team Fortress 2 is this dinky little steam locomotive model seen on the arena map Lumberyard. It seems to be based on a late 1800s era 040T built by the H.K. Porter Company. 040 refers to the wheel arrangement, 0 leading or pilot wheels up front, 4 driving wheels in all in the center, and 0 trailing wheels in the back. These small and lightweight locomotives were commonly used at mines, industrial centers, and in this case, crudely built logging railroads and/or lumber yards. With all the locomotives seen in the official TF2 maps covered, it's time to take a brief look at the railroad infrastructure seen in-game. Returning to Well, we can see these signals located near the yellow doors. These are known as dwarf signals, commonly seen near bridges or in yards. This mainline signal is known as a tri-light for its 3 separate lights placed in a triangular fashion. And these signals are Union Switch and Signal, or USNS, color light signals. This switch stand, used to change the track the train will travel on, seems like a generic design, though it does resemble stands used by the Canadian National Railway. There's one problem though. Where they're placed at in-game here, they aren't serving any purpose and won't be switching any tracks anytime soon. The last piece of notable railroad infrastructure is this catenary structure. Resembling that of a Pennsylvania railroad design, there aren't any electric locomotives in TF2 that use overhead wires as a power source, so this design choice is a bit odd. Now it's time to compare the retail release of TF2's freight cars to their real-life counterparts. On the map Well, we can find a good variety of rail cars. Here we have some open hopper cars loaded with stone or gravel. These look fairly similar to some bathtub coal gondola cars built in the late 1960s and early 1970s. These can be found across the US and Canada on long and heavy coal trains. The side of the in-game model says Güterwagen, which in German translates to goods wagon. Moving on, we find the ubiquitous boxcar. Both blue and red versions, apart from their colors, are essentially identical and resemble a Pullman Standard PS-1 40-foot boxcar. The PS-1 was built beginning in 1947 and lasted until around the 1950s. Rebuilds were prevalent into the 1960s and 70s as well, however. They were used to carry just about anything, whether it be grain, furniture, household appliances, toys, tools, Gaben himself.
My favorite class is the Spy.
Almost anything went into boxcars. These could be found in regular freight service up until the 1980s and 90s in the US and Canada. Some remain in service on maintenance work trains or are preserved at museums and tourist railroads. Next up is this tank car. It somewhat resembles 1960s and 70s designs, though the tank itself is rather large in size compared to the real-life counterpart. Here we have some flat cars. They appear to be pretty generic designs, though they do resemble fairly standard American flat cars of the time, albeit a bit more heavy-duty. We find them loaded with something a bit familiar. Kinda maybe reminds you of something I've discussed before. This car right here on Powerhouse, hidden within an inaccessible room in both spawns, appears to be a well car used for intermodal containers. Well cars didn't appear on American railroads until the 1980s, so in that case it doesn't really fit TF2's time period. Before we get to the last piece of rolling stock, I'd like to briefly discuss the payload cart on Frontier. You'd think it's a completely fictional design, but it does share a general shape with the Russell Snowplow Company railroad snowplow. These were developed just after World War I and continue to be used today with more modern designs. Now last, but certainly not least, is this caboose. Fitting for the end of our journey and the analysis of trains in Team Fortress 2. The car resembles a Pennsylvania Railroad N5 caboose first built in 1914. They lasted in service throughout the 1960s and 70s, and several examples are preserved in various museums across the US. Well, that's a wrap. That's all the locomotives, freight cars, and railroad infrastructure seen in Team Fortress 2. Maybe one day an update will bring us some new train content to analyze.
In the meantime, this is where I get off.